As we get started this morning, I want to remind you that this coming Saturday, the 20th of July, we're going to have our summer cookout. Now, this is a big event every year because what we do is we spend the entire week knocking on doors through our community, inviting our community to come out to this cookout to enjoy a meal and enjoy fellowship with us. So this is more than just a get-together among our brothers and sisters in Christ. This is an evangelistic opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to connect with our community. And we've had several people from our community come out and enjoy a free meal with us, and we want to encourage you to be aware of this, to come out and be a part of it. The food is free. There are activities around our pavilion campus over there on Buford Highway, and we want you to come out and be a part of this, and we want you to connect with our community with us. So please be making plans. This Saturday, July 20th, beginning at 11, food will be served around 11:30. Come out to our pavilion on the Buford Highway campus and join us as we connect with our community in this unique way. So don't forget about that. This morning, I want to open up by telling you about someone I have mentioned before. Her name is Florence Chadwick, and she was one of the greatest swimmers of the 20th century. She was the first woman to swim across the English Channel both ways. She set record times in doing so. She was the first woman to swim the Straits of Gibraltar, the Bosporus Strait, and the Dardanelles. She set records as a female swimmer. But on July 4th, 1952, she set her sights on becoming the first woman to swim the 26 miles between Catalina Island and the California mainland, right there outside of the Southern California area. After swimming for approximately 15 hours, a dense fog had settled over the bay, and it was so thick that she could not see land. So she swam, and she swam, and she swam, and she felt like she was just swimming in circles because she had no bearings, she had no direction, she didn't know which way she was going. So after 15 hours in the water, she did something she had not done. She asked her safety crew to pull her out. She climbed into the boat, and that's when she discovered that she was less than 1 mile from shore. A 26-mile swim. She had made it 25 miles and asked to get out of the water. She told reporters later that day that if she could have seen land, she would have made it. Once Florence Chadwick lost her vision, she lost hope and gave up. That's why it's so important for us to focus on Jesus. That's why we've been engaged off and on this summer in a study of Jesus called House Calls. We've been focused on those occasions when Jesus was present in a house and seeing what we can learn from those particular events and those particular interactions, because we must be focused on Jesus. And this morning, we're turning our attention to a new house. We're turning our attention to a house in which one individual completely loses focus of Jesus. And that's the house in Bethany that we read about in John chapter 12. In John chapter 12, a dinner is held in Jesus' honor at a house in the town of Bethany. Now, Bethany was a suburb of Jerusalem. It was only 2 miles between Bethany and the holy city. What we do know about Bethany is that it was the hometown of some of Jesus' best friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Now, Jesus had paid a visit to their house once before. You can read about that visit in Luke chapter 10. And you may be familiar with it because that's the occasion when Jesus is there in the house and Martha is serving as host, and Mary decides to sit at Jesus' feet to listen to him, which prompts her sister Martha to complain that Mary's not helping her with the serving. And Jesus informs Martha that Mary had made the better choice in that situation. But that's not the occasion we're focused on today. You see, in John chapter 12, we don't actually know whose house they're in. It's possible that it is the same house, the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. That's possible because all three are present in the story. You can see that in John chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Lazarus was there reclining with Jesus at the table as another guest. Martha was there serving, or at least helping serve the meal. And Mary was there anointing Jesus' feet with a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard. It could have been their house, but it's not necessarily their house. Regardless of whose house it is, the dinner is being thrown for Jesus. We're in the chapter immediately after he brought Lazarus back from the dead. Jesus is at the peak of his ministerial career at this point, and a dinner is being held in his honor in Bethany. And while the focus of this house call is typically on what Mary's doing for Jesus, this morning I want the focus to be on Judas. Look at verses 4 through 6 again with us. The text says, "But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, he who was about to betray Jesus, said, 'Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?' He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it." Judas got upset when Mary anointed Jesus' feet with that expensive ointment. He thought she should have given it to him to be placed in the group's treasury. However, John does let us know that the reason Judas thought this way was not because he was concerned about funding Jesus' mission, it's because he was concerned about funding his own interests, since they found out later he was stealing from the communal bank account. Now, before we go any further, I want you to realize a few things about Judas, because it's very easy for us to just know the end of the story about Judas and not think about the beginning of his story. See, we need to realize this. Jesus chose Judas to be an apostle. This wasn't an accident that Judas was present. This wasn't an accident that he was one of the 12. Judas was chosen by Jesus. And I want you to get this. If you turn over to Luke chapter 6, where we're told about Jesus' selection of the 12 apostles, Judas was among those named. He was chosen after Jesus spent an entire night in prayer. This wasn't a rash decision by Jesus. He didn't make this decision abruptly. Jesus chose Judas, if I can get back to where I'm supposed to be. Jesus chose Judas after spending hours deliberating, conversing, talking to God about who should be an apostle. Jesus was intentional in his choice of Judas. The fact that Judas was among those of Jesus' disciples who were chosen to be an apostle should not be overlooked. It was not an accident that he made it into the 12. On top of that, not only was Judas chosen to be an apostle, but we know that Judas was appointed to an executive position among the apostles. In that passage we just read from John chapter 12, we're told that he had charge of the money bag. What that's essentially telling us is that he was the treasurer of the group. And here's the thing, Judas is the only apostle that we know of that is recorded in the Bible as having such a position. There is no one identified with any other special position among the apostles. As far as we know, he is the only apostle to get a specialized position. And that could be an indicator of just how well he was thought of by Jesus or by his peers. this could be an indication that he was a recognized leader in the group, that they looked at him and thought he was trustworthy. Isn't it funny? They have a guy with an accounting background among them. They have a guy named Matthew who was a tax collector. They don't trust him with the money, but they do trust Judas. That's worth mentioning because that means something about Judas stood out. Something about Judas was worthy of being in this appointed position. So Judas was chosen by Jesus and appointed to an executive position. But on top of that, we know that Judas was not suspicious. None of the other apostles were suspicious of Judas. If you jump over to John chapter 13, to the Last Supper, to the moments before Jesus' betrayal, in John chapter 13, as they're having the Last Supper, all of the apostles are gathered with Jesus in a house around a table. And Jesus in verse 21 and 22 says, "One of you will betray me." And we're told that the disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. And that's when Peter gets John's attention because John is sitting next to Jesus. And Peter motions for John to find out who he's talking about. I can only imagine that Peter wants to find out who this traitor is going to be so he can handle it Peter style. So John asks Jesus who it is that's going to betray him. And Jesus says, "It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it." Now here's the thing. None of the apostles think it's one of the other apostles. So Peter gets John to ask, okay, specifically which one is it? And Jesus says, okay, it's going to be this one, the one I give this bread to when I dip it. Now, if you're at that table, if you're one of the apostles at that table, are you not watching his hand the rest of the night to see who he gives that bread to? And yet, as the story unfolds, there in verse 28 and 29, now no one at the table knew why he said this. When he dismissed Judas, I should go back to verse 27. He takes that morsel of bread and he says to Judas, "What you are going to do, do quickly." And no one at the table knew why he said this to Judas. Some thought that because Judas had the money bag, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. He thought he was giving Judas other instructions. Jesus just told them, hey, here's how you know who it is. And they completely missed it because they're not suspicious of Judas. They don't think Judas is any different than them. In fact, if you go over to Matthew's account of the Last Supper, in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 22, when Jesus announced that there was a traitor in their midst, we're told that every one of them said, "Is it I, Lord?" Every one of them asked Jesus, "Is it me?" Not one of them said, "Hey, is it Judas? I bet it's Judas." No, not one of them was suspicious of Judas because he was just as committed to the cause as they were. So Judas was worthy of being selected for a distinguished position of an apostle. Judas was so well respected that he was tasked with financial oversight of the group's resources, and Judas was so devoted to the mission that the other disciples never suspected him of becoming a traitor. So what happened? Well, that brings us to what I consider to be the fourth thing we know about Judas. I believe the events in the Bethany house reveal that somewhere along the way, Judas apparently grew disappointed with Jesus. Let me explain what I mean. All of the apostles, like all of the Jewish people of that day, had some expectations of the Messiah. It was assumed that the Messiah would be a military conqueror similar to King David, and he would ultimately free them from their Roman occupiers and establish an earthly kingdom that would restore the glory of Israel. And you can see this expectation in the apostles. For instance, you can see it after Peter's great confession in Matthew chapter 16, verse 21 and 23, after Peter had just confessed who Jesus is, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And upon hearing Jesus say these things, we're told in verse 22 that Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." Now, why did Peter do that? Because Peter and the other disciples, for that matter, expected Jesus to establish an earthly kingdom. If Jesus turned himself in to be executed by the authorities, then in Peter's mind, that would undermine the establishment of his kingdom. And Jesus responded to Peter's rebuke by telling him in verse 23 of Matthew 16, "You are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of men." Jesus is in effect telling Peter that his expectation of the kingdom was not in line with God's plan for the kingdom. And so right there, after this beautiful climactic moment of confession, we see the earthly Peter again. We see this expectation that existed within the disciples that Jesus would establish an earthly kingdom. You can see it again when James and John asked Jesus for a favor over in Mark chapter 10. Their request was, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." In other words, they wanted to flank Jesus in his earthly throne room. And Jesus responded to their request by saying, "You do not know what you are asking." They went on to say, then Jesus went on to say, "To sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." Jesus pointed out that their request was born out of ignorance and that they did not fully understand his kingdom. And once again, we have this evidence that they're expecting something on earth that was not the expectation of God. But the most apparent this becomes is in Acts chapter 1. This is after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. This is after those events that changed the whole narrative of the Messiah and of the kingdom. And just before Jesus ascends, immediately before he ascends, you look at Acts chapter 1 and verse 6 and look at the final question the disciples collectively ask Jesus. "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" What? You just witnessed the death, burial, and resurrection. You just saw the events that you didn't expect to happen, and you still think there's going to be an earthly kingdom. Do you not get it yet? Are you that thick? And you know what? They are, because we would have been. We would have had the exact same expectations because of the way we would have interpreted the Old Testament just like they did. They still didn't get it, but right before he was going back into heaven, going to his true throne room, going to his true glory. They still didn't get it. And you know what? Judas was one of them. If they didn't get it by this point, and Judas has already died by this point, has already committed suicide by this point, if the other disciples who were faithful, who weren't traitors, hadn't gotten it by this point, I don't think Judas had either. See, all of Jesus' apostles, including Judas, expected Jesus to set up an earthly kingdom. Judas was simply the one who allowed his disappointment to foster betrayal. Think about it this way. Since we know that Judas was not only the group's treasurer, but also stole from their financial resources, we can conclude that his outburst against the use of expensive perfume to anoint Jesus' feet revealed that money rather than mission had become his chief motivation. He was less concerned about the mission of Christ at that point and more concerned about financial gain at that point. So it's conceivable to think that Judas had reached a point where he was disillusioned with what they were doing. If Jesus wasn't going to become an earthly king, then in Judas's mind, following him no longer provided a financial gain. Think about it this way. Since Judas held the office of treasurer during the messianic campaign of Jesus, in his mind, what position would he have held once Jesus became king? How would Jesus becoming king on earth have benefited Judas if he had managed their resources during their little itinerant mission? What kind of resources would he have his hands on when Jesus sat on a throne? So it's at least possible, if not likely, that when Judas realized Jesus was not going to establish an earthly kingdom, he simultaneously realized there was no future financial gain to following him. So maybe he decided to cash in one last time. Because when you jump over to Matthew chapter 26, you find out that one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. Judas's negotiation with the chief priest over the arrest of Jesus centered around how much he would get paid if he led them to Jesus so they could arrest him in private and not create a scene in public. It was all about getting paid. Judas had reached a point where he didn't see any profit in following Jesus anymore, so he's going to make his profit from turning Jesus in. And it's very interesting to me because 30 pieces of silver, according to the things I've read, would be equivalent to about a 4-month salary. That would give Judas just enough time to cover his expenses until he figured out what to do next. It was a severance package, if you will. So Judas was focused on his own finances when he scolded Mary for not selling that expensive perfume for 300 denarii in the Bethany house. And he was focused on his finances when he asked the chief priest, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" Then settled on a price of 30 pieces of silver. And this personal financial focus at the end of Jesus' life reveals a driving force in Judas' own life. It shows that he had revolted against Jesus as his master and had chosen a new one, the master of money. And I believe there's enough circumstantial evidence in the Gospels for us to conclude that his decision was due to the fact that his messianic expectations had gone unmet. That he was disappointed that this wasn't going to produce an earthly kingdom. You see, disappointment can be faith-shattering. And all of us are familiar with disappointment because all of us have expectations. And when our expectations go unmet, we experience disappointment. You realize that? You have expectations all the time. And I have expectations all the time. You came into this building with expectations. You came into this building with expectations about where you would sit. You came into this building with expectations about the songs we would sing. You came into this building with expectations about how I would be dressed up here. You came into this building with expectations about the length of my sermon. And I plan to exceed your expectations. You came into this building with expectations, and when our expectations don't get met, we get disappointed. And you know the arena of life that we tend to have the greatest expectations and the greatest disappointment when they go unmet really falls in the arena of faith, spirituality, and religion. Because we believe our expectations are biblical, even if they're not. We have expectations that we think meet biblical criteria that are faith-based, and therefore our expectations are the final word. And sometimes we attach to our expectations biblical basis that isn't even there. And that's where a lot of our disappointment comes from. See, Judas had expectations that went unmet. It fostered his disappointment, which led to his betrayal. He thought he knew who the Messiah should be and what the Messiah should do, and when Jesus didn't meet his expectations, he allowed his disappointment to take control. And the same thing can happen to us when we grow disappointed with Jesus or his kingdom. Disappointment can arise when your request isn't answered the way you wanted it to be answered. Jesus told us to ask for anything in his name, and when those requests aren't fulfilled according to our will, it can be very disappointing. Such was the case for the rich young ruler who wanted a comfortable answer to the request regarding what he needed to do to inherit eternal life, but then Jesus told him to sell all he had and give it to the poor, and that rich young ruler walked away sorrowful. Have you ever prayed for something to come to fruition that didn't? It can be very disappointing. And maybe you're battling that disappointment today. But disappointment can also arise when you encounter a teaching that seems difficult or unfair. Do you realize that some of the things Jesus said are incredibly difficult to follow? That at times border on feeling unfair. Linking God's forgiveness of us to our forgiveness of others, that is unfair. Loving your enemies and praying for them, that is difficult. Accepting what Jesus says about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, that's a challenge. Hearing Jesus declare that we're not worthy of him if we love our mother and our father or our children more than we love him, that's not easy. Jesus said some really challenging things, and sometimes you can come across one of those teachings and it can just rock you, it can disappoint you, and it can harm your faith. Maybe that's where you're at today. Struggling with the teaching of Jesus. There were some people that struggled with Jesus' teaching. In John chapter 6, after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus said, "Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life." And we're told that many of Jesus' disciples turned back and no longer walked with him because that was too hard of a teaching and they could not accept it. Maybe you're facing that right now. You know, disappointment can also arise when discipleship becomes inconvenient. There were 3 potential disciples in the life of Jesus, 3 guys that either offered to follow Jesus or declared they would follow Jesus, but when they heard the conditions, they realized, oh no, I don't want to be a part of that. One of those guys offered to follow Jesus, and Jesus simply said, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. In other words, Jesus was saying, hey, I don't always have accommodations. This is not a comfortable lifestyle. I can't guarantee that we're going to have room and board tonight. And suddenly, that would-be disciple disappeared from the text of Scripture. Nothing ever is told of him. I guess comfortable betting was where he drew the line in the sand. You see, when inconvenience becomes a part of the discipleship experience, it can be very easy to grow disappointed and to walk away from Jesus. Maybe you're there right now. Maybe it's inconvenient to proclaim Christ in your life, and you're very much disappointed. Maybe your setting in life, your goals in life are incongruent with the life of a disciple. And so you're finding it very inconvenient, and you're discouraged as a result. And disappointment can arise when a crisis negatively affects your life, despite your faithfulness to Christ. You know, Jesus said in John chapter 10 that he came that we might have life and have it abundantly. And some people have taken that to mean that my life should be problem-free. And then when crises arise, when there are storms and there are circumstances that are difficult and there are situations that you don't want to experience, when those things surface despite your faithfulness to the Lord, you start to wonder, why is this happening to me? I thought this was supposed to be a cakewalk once you started following Christ. And so the difficulties of life, the crises we face, can sometimes lead to disappointment because there's this underlying assumption that life's supposed to be easy once you put on Christ. That's not what He promised, though. And disappointment can arise when church leadership makes a decision that you don't like. This might be one of the more prominent ones. I often think back to Acts chapter 15 because there was a decision reached by the apostles and the elders of the church in Antioch and the elders of the church in Jerusalem that I'm sure wasn't pleasing to many a Christian at that time. And it was a decision to allow Gentiles into the church without circumcision. And there were a bunch of Jewish Christians who did not find that acceptable. There are books in the New Testament addressing that very subject, like the book of Galatians and even the book of Hebrews, where you have this author trying to reach to this Jewish audience and say, hey, don't go back to Judaism. Stay with Christ because He's better. Don't lose your focus on Christ. And yet oftentimes when decisions are made that we don't agree with, it doesn't matter whether or not the Bible agrees with it. It doesn't matter whether or not it is doctrinally correct. It matters whether you like it or not. And we turn our back on Jesus as a result. Our disappointment over a decision that may not even be a doctrinal issue can sometimes be what causes us to walk away. And there's one more. It's not on the handout, not on the PowerPoint. Disappointment can arise when someone wearing the name of Christ doesn't treat you Christ-like. We can be disappointed when we encounter a fellow disciple who doesn't behave in a Christ-like manner towards us. And we can attach our affiliation with Christ to whether or not we experience hypocrisy in His church. And that becomes our benchmark for whether or not we want to be affiliated with Christ. Whether or not mortals who we know have sinned, who we know are imperfect, who we know are incapable of perfection, don't act perfectly. And suddenly we're disappointed with Jesus because fallen people fell. Here's what I want you to know about all these disappointments. They pale in comparison to Christ. No matter what you're disappointed by, Christ is greater than that. Christ came to be the perfection of all our imperfections. Christ came to be the righteousness that you can't be. And so when He addresses Judas there in John chapter 12, I want you to notice what He said. After Judas has complained about Mary's failure to give that perfume to Him, Jesus said, "Leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." Jesus did not directly condemn Judas's greed, but He did indicate that Judas had the wrong focus. He's saying, Mary's focused on me. Judas, shouldn't you be focused on me? Isn't that the same thing He told Martha when she complained about Mary's lack of help when she hosted Jesus in her house back in Luke chapter 10? Isn't that kind of the same thing Jesus was saying to Peter when Peter started to sink on the Sea of Galilee? Isn't that an overarching message of Jesus? Focus on me and forget the peripheral things. The peripheral things don't matter in comparison to me. Isn't that ultimately what the author of Hebrews is trying to tell us? In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, where we're instructed to lay aside every weight and sin, which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. In the simplest of terms, the author of Hebrews is telling us that if we want to run the spiritual race successfully, then we're going to have to stop focusing on everything that weighs us down, which would include our disappointments, and solely focus on Jesus. Pictured on the screen is an Olympic athlete named Marla Runyon. She gave her all to try and qualify for the Olympic Games in '96, but her best time finished short of the mark to make the United States team. She was a runner. She ran the 1,500-meter race. And when she failed to make the team in '96, she returned in 2000, trying out for the Sydney Olympics, and she succeeded. Her 8th place finish in the 1,500-meter race was the best finish ever for a United States woman runner in that event at the Olympics. But the thing that makes her accomplishments even more remarkable is that she is legally blind. She is the first legally blind athlete to ever qualify for and compete in the Olympic Games. She developed something called Stargardt's disease, which is a form of macular degeneration, and as a result can only see shapes and blurs. However, she says that her lack of vision is actually an asset when it comes to running because she just focuses on the finish line in front of her rather than looking around to see what the other runners are doing. In other words, everything is a blur. She has to focus in on one thing when she runs. And for her, she figures out where the finish line is and she doesn't see anything else. Our problem is that we're so busy looking at everything else going on around us that we're not focusing on Jesus. When Jesus is our focus, when we are looking unto Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, we'll finish strong. But when we start looking at everything else, all the sin and the baggage that weighs us down, we'll get distracted. We need that singular focus to make it to heaven. That's what Judas lacked. That's what led to his disappointment. And that's what will lead to ours as well. So this morning, as we're gathered here and we're talking about Jesus, I just want to ask, is he your focus? And if he is not, what needs to happen for him to become that? If you're disappointed with anything in your life right now, why not lay that aside, as Hebrews 12 tells us? Why not bring that baggage here right now and lay it at the foot of the cross? Why not make Christ the centerpiece of your life? If you have any need to respond to today's invitation, we invite you to come up here to one of these front rows while together we